Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. It's Tuesday the 19th of October and this is Scotland at 7. I'm Andrew Wilson and this evening I'm presenting the programme from Edinburgh. First we will have today's coronavirus update, then I will introduce this evening's guest, and then together we will look at today's news headlines from Scotland and around the world. As of 2 p.m. today, since the start of the pandemic, a total of 3,331,485 people in Scotland have been tested through the NHS Scotland labs and the UK Government regional testing centres. Of these, 2,719,069 have been confirmed negative and 612,416 have tested positive. There are 2,459 new cases of COVID confirmed by a test, although not everyone with the virus will display symptoms and not all those with symptoms will be tested. There are 24 new reported deaths of people who have tested positive. The number of patients in Scotland who have died from complications caused by the coronavirus infection now stands at 8,954. This number only includes those who have died having received a positive test for the virus in the previous 28 days. Of the people who have tested positive, 869 were in hospital last night, 46 of whom were in intensive care. As of 8 a.m. this morning, 4,291,650 people had received their first dose of the COVID-19 vaccination and 3,881,744 had received their second dose. The latest UK daily figures show that 138,852 patients who had tested positive for COVID-19 have sadly died from their illness, and that is an increase of 223 since yesterday. This number refers to deaths in all settings, not just in hospitals. Now, as it's Tuesday, we have an update from the Office of National Statistics. In the week ending the 9th of October 2021, the percentage of people testing positive increased in England and Wales, the trend was uncertain in Northern Ireland, and it decreased in Scotland. There were 820 deaths involving coronavirus registered in the UK in the week ending the 8th of October 2021. Of these, 582 were registered in England, 81 in Wales, 126 in Scotland, and 28 in Northern Ireland. Deaths involving COVID-19 are consistently lower for people who have received 2 vaccinations. Between the 2nd of January and the 2nd of July this year, there were 640 deaths involving COVID-19 in people who had received both vaccine doses in England, which is 1.2% of the 51,281 total deaths involving COVID-19 in that period. Now, I'm delighted to say that we're joined this evening by an eminent and regular contributor, the retired Professor of Media Politics and now a highly regarded independent media analyst, Professor John Robertson. John, how are you doing this evening?
I'm good. Yourself?
Very well, and delighted and very grateful to you for joining us on Scotland at 7 this evening, John. Our first story this evening is that the First Minister has welcomed an ambitious new agreement that recognises the crucial role of devolved, state and regional governments in delivering net zero. The Under 2 coalition, the group of state, regional and devolved governments working together to limit climate change, has agreed an ambitious new Memorandum of Understanding. As the European co-chair, Scotland is urging members to sign the MOU, which is in line with the Paris Agreement, and to commit to achieving net zero as a group no later than 2050, and to reaching it individually as soon as possible. 50 to 80% of adaptation and mitigation actions necessary to tackle climate change will be implemented at the subnational or local levels. With COP26 coming to Glasgow, Scotland will use its platform as co-chair to encourage other subnational governments to sign up during the climate conference. Scotland will be co-hosting the Under 2 Coalition General Assembly in Glasgow on Sunday the 7th of November. The First Minister said, COP26 in Glasgow is one of the world's last chances to deliver on the aims of the Paris Agreement. To achieve that, it is essential that countries turn promises into action, and it is crucial that states, regions and devolved governments play our full part. Collectively, we share responsibility for delivering the actions required to achieve the half of the emission cuts needed at a global level. As European co-chair of the Under 2 coalition, which now represents almost 2 billion people around the world, I urge state and regional and devolved governments to up their ambition. By doing so, we can spur national governments to go further and faster too. So, John, Lang Banks, who's the WWF director for Scotland, said that much of the focus to date has been on big emitters such as the UK, China, and other official parties to the UN climate talks. But in his view, we won't be able to address the climate emergency without actions by devolved nations like Scotland. Now, we'll touch on examples of how devolved governments' hands are tied in respect of energy and climate in a little while. But if their hands are tied, and I'm suggesting here that they are, then how can they make the differences that are required? The Scottish government doesn't make energy policy in the UK, so are we saying that all it will be able to do is to implement UK policy?
Well, I think it's quite surprising. I mean, I agree with what you say, that their hands are tied, but the Scottish government has, with its partners, has achieved quite a lot, and it's been commended by various experts, from the UK and from United Nations. The massive achievement in renewables, 97% in 2020, 97% of electricity produced from renewables, huge tree planting. I mean, 80% of all the new trees planted in the UK were planted in Scotland. So there are things we can do. There are devolved powers, and we have made huge achievements. Although I do agree in the end that the big steps require further autonomy.
Thanks, John. It's an interesting point that you make. We know that the Scottish government is criticised by the opposition so regularly for implementation. Yet, as you say, there are so many examples of innovative and effective and significant implementation on a Scottish scale, be it tree planting or be it changes in building regulations or other initiatives. So, do you think this is a good example of what I've heard described in the past as thinking globally but acting locally?
Yes, that's a phrase I've known for some time, and I think it's a good notion really for all of us really in our lives. I mean, many of us are concerned about things that happen in the world that we feel we can't do anything about, and I think what we need to do is not punish ourselves for that, but just to do as you say, think of what we're trying to achieve globally, but do what we can locally, and it's like water on stone. And lots of ancient wisdom that will support that notion that that's the way to actually achieve change if we all just keep on going.
Absolutely. And also, Langbanks also went on to say that as well as delivering on its own pledge domestically, we hope that the Scottish Government will continue to inspire others by demonstrating climate solutions, help ensure states and regions are included in the UN process, and do all it can to ensure this group of governments deliver substantial emissions reductions on time. Now, by definition, the Scottish Government doesn't inspire the Tory majority who are installed by English voters at Westminster. And as we've said, that's where the levers of UK energy policy are kept. But thinking more generally, how do you think that the Scottish Government is able to inspire either Scottish citizens or other subnational government organisations around Europe and around the world?
Well, again, against the odds pretty much, because as you pointed out, the media coverage is typically the kind of thing that either hides our achievements or digs around. We saw, for example, last night or the night before, Reporting Scotland discovering that Scotland's hospitals hadn't achieved the progress required towards net zero carbon emissions, which was meant to be achieved by 2045. And for some reason, I gather we're not on target yet for that 2045. So they dig around for little scraps. And inevitably, in a very big and complex process, there will be areas in which Scotland hasn't achieved, partly because, again, as you pointed out, its hands are tied. But so the media coverage makes it very difficult. The one thing that's helping quite a bit, and, I'm not one for worship of, hero worship, but the First Minister has been getting out there and making a good impression in Europe, and in particular recently in the Arctic Circle countries. And I think they're getting that. I think they're picking that up. They're seeing, what we're doing, and I think they're behind us. Hopefully, once we get back into Europe, we can have even greater influence.
It's absolutely, John. But it's an interesting point that you make, thinking about this, thinking about the politics more broadly here. Excuse me. We know that we have our own perspectives on the effect and the impact which the First Minister has, both domestically and further afield. But it's probably as instructive to consider the perspective that other countries have and other politicians have, both of the impact and of the success and the role of Scotland's First Minister. What's your are you picking up any signs from other from media in other countries or elsewhere with regard to the way in which they regard the current First Minister and the direction of travel that Scotland seems to be on?
Well, I guess like most others, it's in social media. I mean, I see on Twitter, the senior politicians from Denmark and Iceland and the Faroes speaking well of what we've done and speaking well of the leadership that the First Minister has given. You would never know of course, from the mainstream coverage. I mean, the coverage of the First Minister's TED talk, the coverage of her visit to the Arctic Circle countries and her presentations there has been ignored, biased by omission.
Yes, very much a media blackout. Although I think the TED decided to delay publishing the video of the First Minister's talk, and I don't think it's been available yet. But your point is well made. Both the TED talk and the trip to the Arctic Assembly were notable by their absence. And in terms of the politics again, if the prism that other European and other politicians are viewing the First Minister is partially in comparison to the performance and the attitude of the Prime Minister, does that present a problem for the First Minister because the bar is so very low? Because the Prime Minister seems to go out of his way to paint himself as a figure of fun and to antagonise other nations, especially in the EU. And so, in a sense, is the First Minister being flattered if Johnson is being used as the comparison?
Well, it would be difficult, I suppose, for it to be otherwise. I mean, Johnson's most recent outburst about sandal-clad green police or whatever wielding carrots and kicking your door down and removing your combi boiler. I mean, it's just incredible. I mean, something you wouldn't really imagine a real politician would say. But he knows his constituency. We've spoken about this already. That does him no harm. There are enough people in the first past the post system in the UK to back him.
Absolutely, and as we know from the Prime Minister's speech to the United Nations only a couple of weeks ago, his base apparently are huge fans of the Muppets. But I'm sure we'll be analysing Johnson's particular style of speaking to international bodies and speaking to his base. I'm sure that's something that we'll come back to many times whilst he remains in number 10. But we'll move to a second story that has a very strong green angle to it this evening, and that is because as the UK government announces its net zero strategy today, the SNP has accused the UK government of betraying the northeast of Scotland and failing to meet its responsibilities for a just transition, after it was revealed that the UK government will not invest in a carbon capture and storage facility at St Fergus in Aberdeenshire, and have opted instead to invest in sites in the north of England. The SNP Business and Energy spokesperson Stephen Flynn MP said the move was a complete betrayal of the northeast of Scotland by the Tories, who had previously cut £1 billion of funding for a carbon capture scheme at Peterhead, which was promised in the run-up to the independence referendum. It follows separate calls for the UK government to match the Scottish government's £500 million investment in a just transition for the northeast of Scotland, which the UK government has failed to act upon. The UK government's net zero strategy involves an expansion of electric vehicles, including increasing the network of charging points and further growth of offshore wind, as well as investments in new technologies such as hydrogen and sustainable aviation fuel, towards with energy security and stable prices in the years to come. Households will benefit from grants to install low-carbon heat pumps as part of a £3.9 billion plan for decarbonising heat and buildings, including a £450 million three-year boiler upgrade scheme. Ministers were under pressure to publish the strategy ahead of the COP26 climate summit, which, as we know, begins in Glasgow in less than 2 weeks' time. Meanwhile, concerns have been raised about how serious the UK government's net zero strategy is, as an alleged rift between the Prime Minister and the Chancellor has left the plans open to accusations of underfunding. The roadmap to end the UK's contribution to the climate crisis by 2050 is comprehensive, but it seems seriously underfunded, and without Sunak's backing, it could as easily become the route to climate hell as to climate salvation. As the Prime Minister said on Tuesday, I can deploy billions with the approval of the Chancellor. 4 ministers, the Chief Scientific Advisor and Alex Sharma, the COP26 President, all spoke up via the government's press release. Sunak, or indeed any Treasury Minister, were conspicuous by their absence. The fear has been that Sunak and the Treasury were obsessed with only one half of the net zero balance sheet, the costs. But a Treasury review published alongside the net zero strategy takes the same line as all serious economic analysis of climate action. The costs of global inaction significantly outweigh the costs of action. So, John, the Scottish Conservative MSP Liam Kerr, who is the party's energy spokesman, said it's obviously disappointing the Scottish cluster is not in a higher position. Support to develop carbon capture technology is vital for the future of the North Sea energy sector. The Scottish Conservatives have been pushing hard for the North East to be at the forefront of carbon capture. That will not change, and it still will be a UK and world leader. So Liam Kerr tells us that support is vital. Is he using a different definition of the word vital to the rest of us?
Well, the Scottish Conservatives, in their stronghold in the northeast and behind the blue wall up there, have betrayed their voters more than once already. They've betrayed the fishermen already, as we know, and this is another betrayal. Clearly, this was promised. Sir Ed Davey promised it. He's on record as having promised this would be the case, and rather ironically, given the language used by Boris Johnson, I understand that our project was shovel ready. It would have been very straightforward to implement it. It's a very important piece in the whole jigsaw of improving our energy consumption and our emissions. So it's a huge disappointment, but no surprise. And will BBC Scotland will they doorstep Douglas Ross and ask him tough questions? I mean, there have been so many tough questions they could have asked him about Boris Johnson and his chums, and they haven't so far.
Well, that's absolutely right, John. I was going to say to you that given he's a North East MP and MSP, and many of his constituents who are workers will work in the offshore sector, why do you think that we haven't heard from Douglas Ross on this important news item today? And in connection with that, both Ross and Liam Kerr are list MSPs for the North East. So they must be particularly relieved today that there's at least 4 years before another Scottish election.
Well, yes, that's exactly, and it's the same situation, I suppose, with the UK government. To some extent, they're free to make all these mistakes and try and reinvent themselves before the next election. But you feel that if the voters of the North East are presumably smarter than the voters of the South East, and presumably they will remember what has been done to them and kick these charlatans out when it comes to it. There's also a lack of cohesion. There's a lack of cohesion in the cabinet with Sunak and on the one hand, and his notions, a very, very rich man, his notions of reintroducing some austerity, and on the other hand, Boris wishing to spend to save himself in some way. So, and I think the same is true. Douglas Ross has underperformed even in the eyes of his colleagues there. So I would have thought people like Liam Kerr probably see an opportunity to stab him in the back. Unfortunately, even though there'll be blood on the floor, the voters won't necessarily know about it or hear or do much about it.
Well, that's true, John. As you mentioned earlier, this is the second time in 10 years that world-leading proposals for carbon capture projects in Scotland's North Sea sector have been axed by a Tory government. So there's two elements to this question. How many times do Scots have to be bitten by Tory politics before we learn? And at the same time, when will Stephen Flynn and the Scottish Government do something to rectify this astonishing decision?
Well, that's something, obviously I can't speak for what the Scottish Government is capable of doing here. It doesn't sound like a huge amount of money, actually, in terms of the kind of expenditure we see. So it is possible, I suppose, the Scottish Government might step in and make up for that. And it kind of similar to what they did with the bedroom tax. There are sometimes you just have to do something, and it's going to cost a bit, but it may be the Scottish Government will do that because it's very, very important.
Well, it's a good point that you make, John, because we touch on that aspect of the Scottish Government being expected to step in and fund. I think it's half a billion. I think it's about £500 million is spent rectifying the bedroom tax and the rape clause, and also the cuts in social security for young people. And of course, as we know, the Scottish Government have committed £500 million to to carbon capture in the north, to a just transition for workers in the northeast of Scotland. Do you think this might turn out to be another attempt by Westminster, wrong-headedly, I would argue, to cajole the Scottish Government into funding things which really ought to be Westminster responsibilities?
I think they would desperately love to push us into some kind of deficit to demonstrate that we can't manage things properly. Now, the Scottish Government has been very successful so far in managing their budget. Not everybody's been happy, I'm sure, across the country with some of the decisions that have been made, but they have in the end kept the ship right here. So I've heard nothing in the wind about this, but it does strike you as an obvious step they might take.
And there are two other baffling features, I think, behind this announcement today. Well, I'm sure there are more than two, but two struck me immediately. Firstly, the Climate Change Committee, which advises both Holyrood and Westminster, has recommended a 2045 target date for Scotland to be net zero. And that's where our only remaining emissions are being offset. Now, that date heavily relied on the much greater potential that could only be offered for carbon capture and storage in the North Sea sector from Scotland. So, given that the time for action is said to be now, and many politicians have said it is, and we're 12 days away from COP26, why do you think the Westminster government are deciding to slow down and to reduce the scope of projects to achieve carbon capture schemes and to decarbonise large industrial clusters?
I think it's all part of a wider strategy to undermine the Scottish Government. I think the UK government realises how badly it compares if you make an objective comparison of what's been done across a variety of issues. So I think there don't there's much doubt about that. This is a stab in the back. I think the 2045 target's interesting, though. I think if you assume that we're going to have a referendum by 22, 23, something like that, we could be independent 20 years before that target and back in the EU and able to borrow again and to invest. It might be that with a late determined push, we can still hit those targets if independent.
Thanks, John. I'll just pause for a minute and reflect on that picture that you're painting. It's cheered me up no end. But the second thing I was going to talk to you about is that workers in Aberdeen's oil and gas sector, whose engineering skills can rapidly make this happen, working on infrastructure that they themselves built and maintain, and is simply being turned around rather than bringing gas and oil onshore. It takes carbon offshore. And now they've been looking for an alternative, greener industry to which they can transition. So does this refusal to support that transition and to support that just transition for these workers, does that just confirm that Tory energy policy is simply about shoring up former so-called red wall seats in the northeast of England and nothing more than that?
Well, I think that's important to them, isn't it? I don't think the Conservatives really care much about Scotland in that sense. The Labour Party realises that it has no hope unless it recovers some of the Scottish electorate. But I think in England, I think they see the north of England as the first battle and the one that matters most to them. And that's why that decision, I suppose. today.
Of course, John, it's through the prism of Westminster politics. And one final question, John, on this story, from the perspective of the media that you've been looking at and analysing, and your consideration of the way in which these stories are being reported just now. What's your, and this is probably an unfair question, but I'll ask it anyway. What's your betting, John? Climate hell or climate salvation?
Oh, oh, I'm an optimist. I may have mentioned this before. I'm not a crazy optimist, but I think human beings are, human beings are incredibly ingenious, um, and our history so far is of surviving the worst circumstances, and I wouldn't put it past us again. It's this phrase, that yea, though I walk through the valley of death, I will fear no evil, because I am the meanest son of a in the valley. That's human beings.
Thanks, John. I knew you would come up with it would be a glass half full approach, and I'm very grateful to you for that. We'll keep focused on that for the future. Now, we'll move on to our next story this evening, which is that the SNP's Foreign Affairs spokesman, Alan Smith MP, has called on the UK's Foreign Secretary, Liz Truss, to give a statement to the House of Commons on revelations that, contrary to previously understood assessments, the Foreign Office was warned explicitly by the UK ambassador to Afghanistan that the Taliban were far more likely to quickly seize power once US, UK, and coalition troops were withdrawn. The revelations reported in today's Times show that Foreign Office ministers and the Foreign Secretary at the time, Dominic Raab, were indeed aware of the precarious state of the Kabul government, yet the response was chaotic and left thousands of Afghans in harm's way, who could have been evacuated with a more organised response had the warnings been taken seriously. Commenting, the SNP's Foreign Affairs spokesperson Alan Smith said, "We need an urgent statement on these revelations because they give the lie to the information previously communicated to the House of Commons, that the withdrawal could take place safely and that the Afghan government was stable. Today's reports prove that there were instead credible and serious warnings being issued by UK staff on the ground, and it's patently obvious these warnings went unheeded by an indolent Foreign Secretary." So, John, in his appearance before the Commons Select Committee last month, Mr Raab said that that intelligence assessments indicated that Kabul was unlikely to fall this year, and he claimed that a lot of people were surprised by the pace of the Taliban advance. Now, that must have been a lot of people who hadn't been sent telegrams and updates by the British ambassador, who was on the ground, perhaps. So, is this evidence that the now Minister for Justice is Dominic Raab is indolent or ignorant or careless or perhaps a heady mix of all three?
Perhaps Dominic Raab was too busy in a swimming pool in Islamabad enjoying the flumes instead of paying attention to what was happening. But I don't believe for a minute that he didn't know. I don't believe for a minute that the Foreign Office didn't know. I don't believe for a minute that MI6 didn't know. I don't believe that the Americans didn't know that Afghanistan was a house of cards. One push and over it would go. It's just incredible. I mean, that the average person in the street knew that Afghanistan was in trouble, and we know from previous occasions that when groups from outside Kabul decide that they've had enough, now, there are weapons everywhere there. They've all got a Kalashnikov. Then you can be fairly sure it will fall quickly. The paid soldiers will run, and the ones who don't care if they live or die and have only a Kalashnikov and some clothes will win.
Absolutely, John, and it's curious because when he says that a lot of people were surprised, that doesn't, and you listed MI6 and the Americans, that seems to not include the MOD either, because they cancelled all military leave in Afghanistan in July. So it is very curious that the foreign secretary didn't know, or it's maybe not curious that he didn't care. But thinking a little bit more broadly, he had also admitted to the Foreign Affairs Subcommittee that he had no idea how many Brits or eligible Afghans were left behind. Now, we know that Raab hates human rights. He said as much over the weekend as in his new job as Minister for Justice. It appears that he also hates the right to life for humans, for those unlucky enough to be abandoned by his government on his watch in Afghanistan. So do you think, can anyone rely on Raab or the likes of Raab when lives are at stake?
No, I don't. I don't think we can rely really on anyone in this Conservative government on anything at all. I can't imagine that there may be a topic I've missed here where there's somebody in the cabinet who's good at something, but I doubt it very much. Um, you know, it's just appalling. But I've read a bit of history. I'm not a professional historian, but I read a bit of history. I've read about the previous Afghan wars. I've read about the Boer War. I've read about the First and the Second World Wars. And misinformation to keep the public happy is the order of the day. Always, always. The public is misled on a regular basis, and ministers are incompetent on a regular basis, and soldiers and civilians pay for it.
Yes, yes. In terms of historians, the lions led by donkeys seems to be a recurring theme, even into the 21st century. But we'll move on now to our next story, which is that the Airdrie and Shotts MSP Neil Gray has branded the latest revelation of the UK's government's DWP's treatment of universal credit claimants as utterly despicable, as the Public Interest Law Centre exposed evidence that people are being forced to submit photographs of themselves holding a local daily paper outside their home in order to claim universal credit. The Public Interest Law Centre has likened this treatment of universal credit claimants as what kidnappers do, and said it shows how utterly disconnected the DWP is from the lived experience of people surviving on a low income. The instructions were posted on an online universal credit journal and have been confirmed by the DWP as legitimate and part of a package of measures to clamp down on benefit fraud. Commenting, the MSP Neil Gray said, "The Tory UK government should be deeply ashamed of making people jump through these degrading hoops to claim the support to which they are entitled. What they are asking is utterly despicable and, logistically, unworkable." So, John, I'm not making light of this, but it struck me that you could easily picture a Bullingdon Club member like Boris Johnson laughing at poor people being made to jump through bureaucratic and other hoops as are being described by the Public Interest Law Centre today. Is that a reasonable assessment?
I'm shocked that you should think so little of these people. I mean, I really am shocked by that. I wonder if you made a parallel with the mafia there, and I think they should rename the headquarters of the DUP Corleone House. I think that'd be quite a nice name for it. I think it's appalling to return to the serious. I think it's appalling. We're talking about quite small amounts of money by the standards of most of the population, and this is partly based on the notion, I think, that the people who run the country just now have no concept of what it is to be poor. Absolutely no concept at all. It's heartless.
Well, that was also something I was going to ask you, John. So, photos of local papers, local daily papers at the front door. Wondering what will be the next thing that's that's said to be legitimate and part of a package of measures to clamp down on benefit fraud. I'm wondering if they'll require claimants to wear badges, perhaps. So, what do you think
Yes.
is the motivation behind humiliating and othering people who are claiming social security?
It's based on it's a cultural thing based on class. That this elite that we have, uh, built around people who have been to private schools and who live in certain kinds of communities, is that they have learned to dehumanize the rest of the population in a similar way that ethnic minorities sometimes are dehumanized before they're massacred. It's easy to think, we'll cut the benefits for people that you don't think are as human as you are, somehow lesser, because of the stereotypes, that they read in the newspapers or comedians portray. Um, it's it's just disgusting, really.
Yes, as it happens, I was struck. I was reading about the Allport scale earlier this week, which is a measure of the manifestation of prejudice in a society. And the first of the five on the first stage of that scale is what's called antilocution, which occurs when the in group freely advances negative images of the out group, hate speech, and making fun of the out group, as Allport calls it. So it certainly sounds like it is based on prejudice.
Absolutely, dehumanization, really. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thanks, John. We'll move on to our next story this evening, and that is that an SNP MP has today introduced a bill aimed at ensuring power over employment laws are transferred to the Scottish Parliament, where they belong. Gavin Newlands MP has lodged the presentation bill in Parliament today in what is the first step towards securing full power over workers' rights for Holyrood. The Devolution Employment Scotland Bill would transfer legislative power over employment matters to the Scottish Parliament, allowing Holyrood to start bringing Scotland into line with the rest of Europe. The move follows the MP's months of campaigning on the issue of fire and rehire, where workers are threatened with the sack if they do not sign up for lower pay and conditions. That's a tactic used over recent months by companies such as British Airways, British Gas and Tesco during the pandemic. Despite condemnation of the practice by UK ministers, including the Prime Minister, no action has been taken to close the loophole that allows workers to be bullied into submission. Devolving powers over employment law to the Scottish Parliament would allow Holyrood to act where the UK government has refused to amend the law in favour of better and wider workers' rights. So, John, with growing chaos in labour markets and a cost of living crisis looming for workers and non-workers alike, do you think that we are likely to see a devolution of employment laws in order that workers' rights can be strengthened? And that's after a Tory government which has spent 10 years encouraging low-wage, unsustainable zero-hours contracts and supporting and paying lip service to fire and rehire practices amongst large employers. Do you think, is there any chance of third time lucky for Gavin Newlands' bill this time?
Well, I mean, all credit to Gavin for having another go. As I understand it, his first attempt was rejected, and then it was a Labour attempt in between, I think, and he's having another go. But with an 80 majority, the Conservatives will do as they like on anything at all. So, I mean, I guess he has no chance. But whether that responsibility can be devolved, I wouldn't have thought that was out of the picture in terms of the kind of things that the Tories might wish to offer Scotland in an attempt to satisfy us with a bit more autonomy, as long as it's not too kind of critical, like forcing the Trident submarines out. So that wouldn't seem too unlikely that could be devolved.
Well, absolutely. And I was going to thinking about the labour market more generally and employment practices with UK business now addicted to the Tory government's 10-year plan to create a low-wage, low-skill, no-future economy and a labour market to match. Is there any chance of meaningful change in the employment market more generally? I'm thinking of employers under pressure because they can't hire anybody, starting to make changes themselves.
Yes, I mean that's an area in which we can have some hope. I mean, one of the consequences of the pandemic, of course, has been to create a shortage of workers, and a shortage of workers tends to have only one consequence in terms of pay and conditions. They tend to go up. I mean, I don't know what articulated lorry drivers get now, but it's significantly more than it was before, I hope. And we've seen that sort of thing throughout history. Supply and demand, it's at the heart of the capitalist system. The only problem with it, is, of course, is it tends to take some groups forward and leaves others behind them, and creates big gaps within the working classes. So, yeah, I mean, positive in a general sense.
Absolutely. And do you think that with the inevitable tension that will come between what Johnson said, which was to start to increase wages and to create a high wage, high skill economy, and that's what he said. Do you think we're going to see conflict, greater conflict of the like that we've seen already between the Treasury and Downing Street? Because the Treasury, I'm sure, are already alarmed that if there's labour cost inflation going on, then there's inflation on the horizon, and the Treasury are going to start to panic about that.
Yes, I think that there's already a schism between Sunak and Johnson, and it may be that it comes to nothing as time goes on, but equally it's tremendously risky for them, and it could lead to a change of regime in the Conservative Party. In time for the next election, I wouldn't have put it beyond the mandarins, and the senior members of the party to decide, hey, next election Johnson is not a winner. We'll need to move back to the centre ground. And it wouldn't be, they're a very pragmatic group, the Conservatives. I could see them before the next election, maybe a year or two before, moving back to centre ground and ditching Sunak and going for a more moderate kind of leader. So that's one of the disappointing things from my point of view about the Conservatives is their cynical intelligence.
And their determination to seize and retain the levers of power. And just to bring this back to Scotland for a second, we were talking earlier on about the notable silence from Douglas Ross today, and we were talking about how he was perhaps manoeuvring. It appears that he's out of favour with the Johnson camp at the moment. He was notably passed over for reappointment to the Scotland office. So do you think that given his naked ambition, that Douglas Ross will be lining himself up with the Chancellor now?
Oh, I don't really know about that, but he certainly seems to be losing his glow a little. And I'm not a betting man, so I certainly wouldn't want to put money on that. Who knows what's going to happen with Sunak and Johnson? Johnson remains remarkably strong because he's known to have that base, and he has that ability to communicate in a way that many of us find, childish and comedian-like. But he does have that ability to connect, and that gives him votes, and then maybe that gives him enough votes to survive any kind of challenge from Sunak. I can't see Sunak being popular enough to win in the way that Johnson is.
Thanks, John, and thank you also. Now I'm now stuck with the image in my head of Douglas Ross setting off for work in the morning with his torn face and glowing like the Weetabix children used to in the adverts. Other breakfast cereals are available. We'll move on to our next story, which is that the former President Trump has sought to block the release of documents related to the Capitol attack on the 6th of January to a House committee investigating the incident, challenging President Joe Biden's initial decision to waive executive privilege. In a federal lawsuit, the ex-president said the committee's request in August was almost limitless in scope and sought many records that were not connected to the siege. He called it a vexatious, illegal fishing expedition that was then untethered from any legitimate legislative purpose, according to the papers filed in a federal court in the District of Columbia. Trump's lawsuit was expected, as he had said he would challenge the investigation, and at least one ally, Steve Bannon, has defied a subpoena from the committee. But the legal challenge went beyond the initial 125 pages of records that Biden recently cleared for release to the committee. The suit, which names the committee as well as the National Archives, seeks to invalidate the entirety of the congressional request, calling it overly broad, unduly burdensome, and a challenge to the separation of powers. It requests a court injunction to bar the archivist from producing the documents. The Biden administration, in clearing these documents for release, said that the violent siege at the Capitol more than 9 months ago was such an extraordinary circumstance that it merited waiving the privilege that usually protects certain White House communications. Trump's lawsuit came the evening before the panel was scheduled to vote to recommend that Bannon be held in criminal contempt of Congress for his defiance of the committee's demands for documents and testimony. In a resolution released on Monday, the committee asserts that the former Trump aide and podcast host has no legal standing to rebuff the committee, even as Trump's lawyer has asked him not to disclose information. Bannon was a private citizen when he spoke to Trump before the attack, the committee said, and Trump had not asserted any such executive privilege claims to the panel. The resolution lists many ways in which Bannon was involved in the lead-up to the insurrection, including reports that he encouraged Trump to focus on the 6th of January, the day Congress certified the presidential vote, and his comments the day previously on the 5th of January that all hell is going to break loose the next day. Once the committee votes on the Bannon contempt resolution, it will go to the full House for a vote, and then on to the Justice Department, which will decide whether or not to prosecute Bannon. So, John, it sounds to me from the reporting today that this claim from Trump's lawyers is perhaps rather better drafted and argued than Trump's recent election litigations. I can recognise legal language of a sort that you would see in the courts of Scotland in attempt to argue against disclosure of documentation, for example. And so this is maybe better drafted and argued perhaps because Rudy Giuliani has been suspended from legal practice in several states. But putting that to one side, Do you think, is this going to get any further than all of Trump's recent litigation, by which I mean he's going to make some noise and then lose?
Well, you would hope that he would have no effect at all. It was quite clear to me that he incited a riot and he incited armed militia to attack the Capitol in the United States, one of the world's predominant, maybe not far from perfect, admittedly, democracies. I mean, it was just an astonishing thing he did. People died as a result of it. He's clearly guilty. Everybody knows he's guilty. Everybody who looks at it knows he's guilty. But the complexity, the Byzantine complexity of the American legal system seems to offer the opportunities for people with a bit of money to talk themselves out of the most heinous crimes. I'm watching at the moment, catching up on an American series called Goliath on Amazon Prime with Billy Bob Thornton as a very, very clever, far too clever lawyer. And while I recognise that this is drama, it's fictional drama, I think it exposes the incredible corruption of the system there.
You're talking to another fan of Goliath here, and I'm only disappointed that this is the final series. But no, we'll move on to our next story, John. And that is that Latvia has announced a COVID-19 lockdown from October the 21st until November the 15th to try to slow a spike in infections in one of the least vaccinated European Union countries. Our health system is in danger. The only way out of this crisis is to get vaccinated, the Prime Minister Krišjānis Kariņš said after an emergency government meeting, blaming low vaccination rates for the spike in hospitalizations. Only 54% of Latvian adults have been fully vaccinated, and that's well below the EU average of 74%, EU figures show. I have to apologise to the already vaccinated, Kariņš said, announcing that shops, restaurants, schools and entertainment will be closed, with only essential services available and a curfew in place from 8 p.m. to 5 a.m. Only essential manufacturing, construction and critical jobs will be allowed to continue in person. One of the two largest Riga hospitals began installing makeshift beds for COVID-19 patients in its atrium to cope with the influx, the national broadcaster has reported. No travel restrictions were announced since infection rates elsewhere are much lower and we don't see immediate risks, Kariņš said. New cases in Latvia increased 49% in the week to Sunday, according to its health authority. And the Latvian government cancelled most planned hospital operations last week amid an increased need for beds and staff as COVID-19 cases climb. The country had reported the second worst infection numbers in the EU after neighbour Lithuania in the fortnight to the 10th of October, with 864 new cases per 10,000 people. And the Latvian president, Egils Levits, tested positive last week, prompting Finland's president, Sauli Niinisto, who had breakfast with Levits a day earlier, to self-isolate. So, John, firstly, are there lessons perhaps for us in this, given that the blame for the latest spike in infection rates in Latvia appears to be being laid at the feet of low vaccination rates?
Well, I'm not a medic, I'm not an epidemiologist or a virologist, but I've read a lot in the last year or so. We were talking about this earlier. We've all become partial experts on these things. I guess it's more complex than just that, and vaccination rates clearly are a factor, but we do know that that immunity tends to wane after about 6 months. So we see that from Israel, and I think we've seen examples in Scotland too. So it will be partly that. I guess it's probably more mixing, less wearing of face masks will be factors in this. And I think there are differences between countries in that respect. There are countries where people are still wearing their face masks. I think even within the UK, I've heard people say anecdotally that you can get the train across the border, and at Carlisle people take off the face masks, and when they're coming north, they put a face mask back on again as they enter Scotland. And I've been in supermarkets recently, and I've hardly seen a single person without a face mask, and yet I've seen images on television of English supermarkets with hardly a person with a face mask. So I think that'll be a big factor.
And that's a good point that you make, John, because under this third declaration of a state of emergency in Latvia, people who are not vaccinated, are not double vaccinated for COVID-19 or who have not recovered from a previous infection are not permitted to shop only in stores that sell, are only permitted to shop in stores that sell first necessity goods. That means they're not allowed into supermarkets, for example. Now, it sounds like and there's in addition with a curfew, it sounds like a much more serious lockdown than perhaps we were used to. And also it appears to be seeing the widespread use of such terribly contentious things, and that's contentious only if you're a self-publicist like Alex Cole Hamilton or a foreign broadcaster like the BBC, such contentious things as vaccine passports. So these measures seem to be reasonable in Latvia, but beyond all possibility in Scotland. Why do you think that is?
Well, there's clearly a campaign going on all the time, and especially in Good Morning Scotland and Reporting Scotland with their supply of feeders. Alex Cole Hamilton, one of their regular feeders, there. It's not media reporting. It's not news. It's a campaign. It's a constant campaign, and so any initiative, no matter how successful it might be, across in Denmark or somewhere else, that will be somebody, they will bring on a strip club manager as their expert epidemiologist to tell us that it was a mistake and it's destroying his industry.
Absolutely, John. Thank you. I'm pleased to confirm I don't know any strip club managers, so I can't comment on that. But your point
I've
you make,
heard of them.
absolutely. and for our final story this evening, we have one more COVID news item, and that is that existing COVID-19 safety mitigations in schools are to remain for now, following advice from senior clinicians. Pupils will continue to be required to wear face coverings in secondary school classrooms as they begin to return from the October break. Secondary-aged pupils and staff in primary and secondary schools will also still require face coverings in communal areas or when moving around school buildings. The Chief Medical Officer has advised that while there are encouraging signs, a more cautious approach would allow more time for 12 to 15-year-olds to take up the vaccination. Confirming that school mitigations will remain in place for now, the Education Secretary Shirley-Ann Somerville also urged continued vigilance to protect pupils and staff. Now, John, following on from what you were saying a moment ago, I know that the Cabinet Secretary also said that people would be disappointed at this news that the restrictions were remaining in place for now. Do you think people are really disappointed? I get the impression that folks are well used to these restrictions now, and they well understand the reasons for them.
Well, one or two mothers who are former Conservative candidates will be called into Reporting Scotland to tell us how upset their children are by this. I used to be a school pupil. It's a very long time ago now, but I don't remember at any point thinking I must get into school today to be happy. I was quite happy out of school a lot of the time. I ended up in teacher education, paradoxically. And one of the things that I learned as a school teacher and as a teacher educator, reading research, was that the notion of blended learning, which for many teachers is a word that makes them want to spit, blended learning has a very sound research basis. There is a lot of evidence that children learn very well by themselves, as long as they have the support. They have the resources, neither printed or online, and they have the possibility of tutorials, small group tutorials online and so on. I think it can be a very effective way. I don't think children need to be in school all day and every day. I think in certain subjects, they'll learn far better if they can get a bit of peace to work by themselves. But teachers, for all their qualities, are a very conservative bunch. And the classroom is the centre of their sacred identity, of who they are. And as soon as the children are away somewhere else, learning without them, they start to panic about it. But there's a very sound research base for changing schools education. University education is already changing towards the open university model. Just proven, its success is proven. There's no doubt about that. But there's no political will because of fear of the teacher unions.
Of course, no, I understand, John, completely. Thank you. And just for the last comment and the last point in the program this evening, we'll return to your area of particular expertise. Now, I didn't listen to GMS this morning, but I did listen to other BBC coverage, and it struck me that the media appeared to be reporting this story in a way that seemed, at least to me early this morning, to be slightly more even-handed, albeit it was largely anchored with a vox pop, with punters in the street giving their epidemiological and virological qualifications. So, do you think were my ears actually deceiving me because it was so early this morning, or are you detecting any change in the campaign that's being run from Pacific Key?
What a question! What a question! You know, Karl Marx talked about something called repressive tolerance, and that's where a sophisticated system like UK media and its political backers, um, they realised that if they're to be monolithically of one opinion, constantly negative about, say, Scottish independence, people will start to detect that they're not being told the truth. But if now and again they present positive images of Scotland or of Scottish independence, as long as it's less than 50%, then people will start to think maybe they're telling us the truth. And nobody in Soviet Russia or in Nazi Germany believed the media. They knew they were being lied to. But sadly, people in the West seem to think they're being told the truth by corporate and state media. It's astonishing.
Absolutely, John. My apologies for springing that question on you at that point in this point in the program. However, I knew you'd have a great answer, so thank you very much for that. And that was our final news item this evening. In making these programs, Broadcasting Scotland relies on the support of viewers and others who value our distinctive approach to news, current affairs, and culture. If you would like to support us, and we would really like you to support us, then please consider subscribing or donating to Broadcasting Scotland. You will find the link to do that on the screen now. There are other ways in which you can contribute to our work. If you would like to volunteer to work with Broadcasting Scotland, either behind the scenes or in front of the cameras, or in any other way that helps our work and promotes the station, then please visit our website at www.broadcastingscotland.scot and send us a message there. Meantime, firstly, we will be here again at 7 o'clock tomorrow evening with Scotland at 7, so please join us again then. Secondly, thanks to everyone for joining us on Broadcasting Scotland. And thirdly, a very special thanks to our very special guest this evening, Professor John Robertson.
Thank you.
So that's the way it is at very nearly Scotland at 8. I hope that you have a very peaceful evening.